Hey everyone! Today on the plastic canvas we're painting Maggot from Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon by Awaken Realms. Hey everyone, Matt here from the Plastic Canvas and welcome to episode 3 of this Tainted Grail painting series. And today we're painting Maggot. He's one of the characters that you can play as in this story-based exploration game by Awaken Realms. Now, like I said in the previous video in this series, which was Arav, I have kicked off this series by painting Arav and Maggot because my wife, a friend of ours, and myself are going to be playing through this game together, and they took dibs on the two characters that they wanted to play, and they took Ailey and Beor, I think. I don't know, there's lots of names in this game that I really don't know how to pronounce. Anyway, they took the characters that they want to play as, and that left Arav and Maggot. And I haven't yet decided who I'm going to be painting, but so that I do have a painted character when I finally do decide, I'm starting off by painting these two just to get them done. And then, yeah, when we get to playing them, I've got a painted character. So the next video in this series will probably be the menhirs. I sort of want to get onto them because they are the most imposing thing on the board, I suppose, in this game. So I sort of want to get them done, and then there'll be the Four Dweller as well. And I'm thinking of doing a video of the dials, I think they are. I'm not really sure exactly what they're for at the moment because obviously we haven't started painting. But yeah, those dials that sit at the bottom of the menhirs, and they sort of get turned each turn, I think. I think it's a bit of an indication about when you need to relight them. Anyway, so that'll be sort of the next couple of videos in this series. So if you're going to be interested in seeing how they get painted, make sure you hit the subscribe button so that you know when they get painted. And that will round out the base game of Tainted Grail. And I'm pretty sure we have split shipping for Tainted Grail, which means that there will be some more stuff arriving at some point next year. But we have a bunch of games arriving in the next 12 or so months from Kickstarter, and they all sort of end up blurring together, you know, what you're getting for each one. But yeah, I'm pretty sure we have some more coming next year, but I'm not totally sure what it is. But yeah, so if you're going to be interested in seeing how I paint the rest of this game, hit the subscribe button, and there will be more stuff for Tainted Grail next year as well. Alright, so with that stuff out of the way, we can get into talking about what I'm doing here with Maggot. So really, he's a pretty standard mini. There's nothing out of the ordinary going on with him. There's no OSL or anything like that takes, you know, a technique that is not commonly used. So in terms of the steps that I go through and the techniques that I do use, they are very, very similar to how I've been painting the last few minis. So if you've been watching my last few videos, you'll know how I'm going to approach painting this guy. And I think that's good for this stage in my painting because I reckon, so I've been painting for just over 18 or so months at the moment. And in the last 6 or so months is where I've really worked out what my painting style is and what the best ways are for me to go about completing certain steps or getting certain effects. So, you know, like how I highlight and shade and different things like that. So I've been able to put a few different techniques in my toolbox, I suppose you would say. And so I would say that at the moment I'm in the consolidating stage of my painting where I don't necessarily want or need to be adding too much more to my toolbox. I think what's more beneficial for me at the moment is to really focus on those techniques that I have developed and just to keep refining them and improve them as much as I can so that then I can use them as a foundation to build more techniques on. And so a character or a mini, like Maggot is absolutely perfect for that because it is just prime, base coat, highlight and shade, you know, all those little finishing off, you know, picking out the details or those sorts of things. And just a little bit of basing to finish it off. So there's no real spots here where there's anything new being introduced for Maggot. And so he's a perfect mini for me at the moment because, similar to Arav and other ones that I've painted recently, it does give me the chance to really just focus on those core skills and techniques that I've worked out in the last 6 or so months. Allows me to really refine them, and when I've then really got those techniques just down pat and I don't really have to work at them too much or think about it too much, it's just going to make my painting in general just so much easier. Because if you think about, like say reading for example, the more words that you can just recognize without having to work them out, the easier your reading becomes. Same thing here with painting. So it just means that once I've got these core skills down pat that I've found that really work for me, that's when it'll be easier to then move on to things like OSL or whatever, because then I can focus my time on developing those techniques rather than these basic ones that I just want to get down pat. And then I don't have to sort of stretch myself to be focusing on, highlighting and shading and OSL and this and that. So just really, I'm just trying to focus my efforts at the moment on, just developing those ways of painting that I've worked out for myself, and then not, stretching too thin and trying to do too many different things. Just get them down really well, and then I can move on to more advanced techniques. So an aspect of my painting that I am really trying to focus on at the moment is my highlighting and shading, in part because it is such an important step for finishing off a mini, but also because when I first started painting, it was probably the most difficult step with painting a mini that I found. Because early on, I only had a very, very limited range of colours. So I had, A red, A blue, A green, and so on. And so I had to, stretch them to be able to get different tones and things like that. So let's say I was painting something brown. I'm just picking out brown because I've painted part of Maggot brown there. So I would just base coat with the one brown that I had. And one thing that I was doing early on was trying to wet blend in the shadows as I was painting, and then after it's dried, then do the highlighting. But anyway, so I'd lay the brown down, and then just mix some black in to the brown to darken it for the shadows. That worked okay, but then when it came to the highlighting, that's where things really got tricky, because the only way that I could really lighten off the brown was to add in white. And so then I would just go to the spots where I thought light would be hitting, and just put down that paint that I'd mixed up there. And I had no ability to blend or to feather out or anything like that. And so what you ended up with was this real defined line between where my highlighting was and where my base coating was. Because I tried that wet blendy thing for the shadows, it kind of worked okay. Really it didn't, but it kind of worked okay. But the highlights just looked all wrong because it just looked like these streaks on there. There was no graduation of colour or any depth of colour or anything like that. And then over time, I then got some washes and I sort of worked out a way to use them. So base coat, put the wash down, and then go back to the base coat, and that would be my highlighting. And still at this point, I only had one of each colour. And so base coat, wash, first stage of highlighting was back to the base coat, and then lighten it off with some white, and then that would be the final stage of the highlighting. So that at least allowed some transition of colours, because it wasn't just the shade, the base coat, and a highlight. So I started to be able to build some depth of colour there. Then over time, as you do, I got more and more paints, and now I have a range of most of the colours, really, at least the ones that get used most of the time. So I have, a good half a dozen reds and greens and blues and so on, and a few browns. So now what I'm focusing on is, base coat, and then whether I do a wash or not comes down to what it is that I'm painting. So I look at how textured the surface is and how close those textures together are. So let's say I'm painting chainmail or hair or something like that, where the texture is really fine and there's lots of recesses really close to each other. That's where I'll do a wash. Or if I pick out a, specifically here on Maggot, I've done a wash on the top part of his robe because there are a lot of creases and folds really close to each other. But on the bottom part of his robe that goes over his legs, those folds and things are quite far apart and there's lots of really broad, smooth surfaces. So I don't do a wash on the bottom part of his robe because there's going to be lots of spots where the wash is just going to sit there, and then it can end up drying really kind of blotchy is what I find. So yeah, I do a wash on the brown part of his robe because the folds and creases are really close to each other, so the wash will just flow nicely into them. And there's very few spots where it's just going to sit on a smooth surface, but I don't do it on the bottom part of his robe that's covering his legs because those creases are so far apart from each other. There's lots of big surfaces for the wash to pull on. Anyway, so I've either done a wash or I haven't, and then it's back to the base coat, pick out all of the first stages of the highlighting, and that's most of the surfaces really. So I just leave the shadows, or at least where the wash has pulled, leave that alone so that it creates the shadows. And then yeah, just pick out the first stage of the highlighting with the base coat again, and then I move to a lighter version of that color, and then pick out the the next stage of the highlights. So where the next most sort of light's going to be hitting, and then just work my way around, and then lighten it off again, and then again pick out the spots that are going to be getting the next most amount of light. Actually, I think I'm saying that the wrong way. So as the light concentration would be getting greater and greater, the paint that I'm putting down is getting lighter and lighter. And also in between each of these color changes, I'm feathering out the edges of each of the highlights so that they blend smoothly from one into the next. And then I just keep doing that until I get to the highest level of highlight that I want. And what that allows is for a greater contrast to be built up, because by layering and smoothly transitioning from one color to another lets me get to a much brighter highlight, a much brighter final highlight than what I could when I first started painting. Because when I first started, when you're only doing one color for the shadow, one color for the base coat, and then one color for the highlight, there's only so far that you can push it, because you still kind of need to have just a brighter looking version of the base coat for that highlight to work. Whereas with the way that I highlight and shade now, I'm always just going for a brighter version of the previous color that I put down, and so that just allows me to go so much brighter. And as I've talked about lots, I think that contrast is just so important, especially because with the way that I paint for these minis to be in the middle of the table. Those highlights and shades need to be seen from people that are sitting around the edge, and so that contrast really needs to be there. So that's an example of a technique that I'm really trying to focus on at the moment and really develop. And yeah, so painting someone like Maggot, who, again, like Arav, which was the previous one, there's nothing out of the ordinary with him, and so all of the highlighting and shading is, quite repetitious, I suppose, and it really just allows me to refine how I go about my highlighting, so I'm not having to find different ways on every single mini to highlight. I'm just able to do it in the same way. So getting onto something, for example, like NMM, so non-metallic metal is something that I want to do at some point, but that's a totally different ballgame to the way that I'm painting here. And so rather than introducing something like that, which I mean isn't really something that I would do with Maggot anyway, but yeah, rather than trying to introduce something new like that, something new for me to explore and build my skills with, this is what I want to be spending my time on at the moment, so that I can get these down pat, and then I don't have to really think or worry about how I'm going to be, highlighting a robe or something like that. I just know how I'm going to do that. I can then focus my efforts on, doing some OSL or non-metallic metal or something like that just takes a little bit more work. Another thing that I've really started to do a lot more in the last few months is to look at each aspect of the miniature and work out when it needs to be painted. Because, again, when I was early on in my painting time, I was very stuck in that mindset of completely finish one stage before you go on to the next. So take obviously priming you need to do first, there's no if, buts, or maybes about that. But then with base coating, I would base coat everything, and then I would do my highlighting and shading as well as I could at the time, but I would totally do that step and then move on to the next one and then on to the next one until it was done. Whereas now what I do is I look at each aspect of the mini and work out when is going to be the best time to actually paint that, and I don't have to completely finish one stage before I move on to the next. So take, for example, if you look at the way that the base coating and highlighting and shading is working here, I base coated quite a bit of him at first, and then I moved on to highlighting and shading his robe around his chest and the fur over his back and his skin, because there are parts that go over the top of those different areas. So say, seeing as I'm painting this snake at the moment, if you go with his skin, there is that snake that I'm painting right now that wraps around his arm. And so if I was to highlight and shade his skin after I had painted that snake, it would be so much more difficult, because what that snake actually ends up doing is it splits his arm into separate sections. So you can see I would need to highlight his shoulder, and then there's kind of his bicep, and then his forearm and his hand. So it splits his arm into 3 different sections. But to make them look like they're under even light, the highlights need to be in the same spot running right the way down his arm. The shadows need to be in consistent locations. And by doing that in 3 separate sections, that's a lot harder than just doing it in one smooth go. And so I highlighted his arm, totally ignoring the snake, so that I could get the highlights running consistently from the top of his arm down to his hand. And then I came back and then painted the snake. So it makes that highlight look consistent, but also what it does is it means that I can paint right up to the edge of the snake without having to worry about getting any paint on it. Whereas if I had painted the snake and then come in to do the highlighting and shading, even if you are much more skilled at painting than I am, you're really not going to be able to get that the paint that you put down to go right up perfectly against the snake. There's going to be some amount of gap in between the snake and your actual highlighting and shading. It's going to leave that base coat there. And so it just makes it so much easier to get, so first of all, a consistent highlight from shoulder to hand by doing it in just one go, but it also means that it's, you don't end up with those little gaps left around the different details. So same thing with the brown part of the robe around his torso, because you can see that I've come back in to pick out these different things that are hanging off of it, different bones and things like that. Rather than trying to highlight and shade in and around them, I didn't paint them until I had finished highlighting and shading the whole robe. Then I came back in and then did those parts. So I didn't just, base coat everything and then go on to the highlighting and shading. I base coated some, then did the highlighting and shading on the parts that I needed to at that stage because of what was going to be painted next. Then I come back and finish off the base coating. Even things like washes here, so I'm putting down the black wash on the different metal surfaces just to take a bit of the shine off and bring out some of the definition. But I did a wash on, I used a brown wash on the brown part of his robe and his skin earlier on, then did highlighting and shading, base coated another couple of bits, and now pulling out a different wash to do that part. So that's a part of my painting that I've really brought in the last few months, whereas I'm not so stuck in that mindset of I've got to completely finish this stage before I can move on to the next one, and then I have to completely finish that stage before I move on to the one after that. It's now really a case of what do I need to be painting now, and how do I need to be painting it so that I can make it look as good as possible, and make my painting as easy for me as possible as well. So yeah, not just getting stuck into that idea that one stage has to be completely finished before the next one can be done. Now, I haven't talked yet about the colours that I chose to paint Maggot yet, so I might get to that now, because I did have a bit of trouble working out exactly what colour I was going to make everything, because there is artwork within the game, and that's always a good starting spot. But as much as I love the artwork that is in Tainted Grail, it's actually not that useful, or at least I didn't find it that useful for working out what colours everything needed to be, because it is quite a stylized sort of artwork. The colours and textures really do just kind of smudge and blend into each other. Even the edge of the artwork really does just blend out into the background. Even the point that the artwork of Maggot on his card is different in quite a few aspects to the actual miniature. So if you look at the end of his staff sort of thing that he's holding, in the artwork it is very clearly this sort of bladed weapon. It's got this real jagged kind of tip to it, whereas here it actually looked, and this is how I interpreted it looked more like a candle, and then it looks like there are, as I'm painting here, there's these sort of wraps that go around. It looks like there are candles tied to the sides of the end of the staff. And so there were just lots of aspects like that where it didn't seem to match from the artwork to the miniature. I can't remember, but I think in the artwork it doesn't have the bones that are hanging off the bottom of his robe there either. So yes, there were quite a few spots where I wasn't sure exactly how I should be painting each part. Now, in some cases, that's a tricky thing, because you're trying to follow the artwork, but you don't know what certain parts should be, and it needs to tie in with the theme, so that can be a bit hard. But in this case, it actually worked alright, because I ended up just ignoring the artwork, except for just a couple of little things here and there that did match, just to make sure that I had the right materials and things like that. But for the most part, totally ignored it and just went with colours that I wanted to. So like the bottom part of his robe that goes over his legs there, in reality it should probably be brown, like the top part of his robe, I suppose. But I've had that Vallejo blue-green, that's what it's called, blue-green, sitting there for a little while waiting for something to use it on. And then as soon as I saw Maggot, I thought, that'll be where I can use it. So yeah, I'd been waiting to use that colour, so I took the chance to use it there for the bottom part of his robe, and I think it actually worked out pretty well in the end. I found that so I normally use Reapers, as you can see, but I found that the Vallejo paint, that was one coat, and it went on really, really nicely, whereas the Reapers are a bit thinner, so they do need usually an extra coat. And that sounds all good for Vallejo. One coat, perfect. I did find it took a bit of adjusting when I got to the highlighting of the bottom part of his robe, because the paint, so normally when as I talked about earlier, when I'm highlighting, I sort of try and blend out each layer of the highlight, and that works really, really well with the Reapers because they are quite thin. They feather out really, really nicely, but with the Vallejo, it really just took so much longer to feather out because that paint is just, I think it's just so much more opaque, I guess. It just took so much longer to blend out. Anyway, that's a thing to talk about later in the video. But yeah, so for all of the colours, so I stuck with the browns, obviously, tying back into the artwork, but then I was free to pick out some other little details, because as I've talked quite a bit in the past, one of the most surefire ways of making your minis look flat is to just use the same colour in big slabs. And so what I always look for are little details that I can pick out in different colours, just to bust up the bigger sections of the colours. So I tried to introduce a couple of contrasting elements so that there was something to break up the monotonous of just, you know, so you've got brown for the top part of his robe, blue for the bottom part. Those are really the only kind of colours in there. I mean, sure, there's his skin and things like that, but outside of them, you know, they were the big bulks of the colour. So I tried to look for ways to break them up. So you can see I painted red. There's a bit of a belt that he's wearing, and a tie that kind of holds the top part of his robe, the part that goes over his shoulder, down to his waist. So I picked them out in red, or the rope kind of thing that's wrapping around his staff, and the bones that are dangling on his back. All those little things like that I picked out in red. So there was consistency there, but that was just a bit of a contrasting element, so that it just helped to break up the bigger slabs of colour there as well. And then yeah, things here like the feathers, I interpreted these as feathers coming off this skull mask that he's got. I painted them red as well, because I felt like red was a suitable colour for that. And yeah, there was no artwork off memory to go with for that. So yeah, so I ended up with quite a bit of freedom with painting Maggot. It was a bit tricky at first. I remember in one of the Zombicide Invader videos, it might have been Jared, I think, I talked a bit there about how when I first started painting the soldiers in that game, I had a lot of trouble just getting into it and starting, because I knew, generally speaking, what colours different parts should be, but once you actually got into looking at the smaller parts of the mini, like all of the different panels of the armor and just different bits and pieces that couldn't be seen in the artwork or weren't clear in the artwork, I really had trouble getting into it, because I just wasn't sure of so many parts what colours they should be. And what I found there is that just by starting, just picking out like the main base colour and just starting with that kind of informed what other colours should be. So if this part is this material, that means that this part next to it should probably be this material or this colour, and it just helped to help me to pick out the parts that I wasn't sure of what they should be. And that's what I sort of found with this guy as well, because there were those couple of bits that I wasn't sure of, because they either didn't appear in the artwork, or it was because of the artistic style, that kind of blurry smudginess that made it unclear what a certain part should be. I just started painting, and certain parts became apparent as I got into it. So, you know, things like his skin and the general colours of his robes and things like that, I knew what they were going to be going in, but some of the little details, some of those things that are hanging off him, I wasn't sure of what they should be at the start, but once I got into it, I then sort of thought, that should be this and that should be that. So yeah, it just made that a little bit easier. So that's definitely a tip that I think I can sort of pass on, is that if you're unsure going into a mini of what colours certain parts should be, don't worry about it. Don't let that be a thing to stop you from getting into painting. Just start painting. Pick out the parts that you do know. Just start painting them, and that, like in some cases here, that may inform what other colours should be. So like, yeah, with his staff there, I really wasn't sure of what that tip was supposed to be, or exactly what was wrapping around it. But once I did get that bronzy sort of colour down, it then helped me to pick out, I reckon those are, they kind of look like candles, so I reckon then these parts on the side are candles as well, and then this is a rope that's kind of tying that all together. It just, I mean, whether it is or not is a totally different story if that's what it's actually supposed to be, but it at least did help me, work out some of those smaller elements that I wasn't sure of. So that's definitely something that I can recommend. Just start painting the parts that you do know, and it'll help inform the parts that you don't. Alright, so now I'm into highlighting and shading the bottom part of his robe here, and what I think this ends up being a really good example of is how you can't always just paint something a consistent colour. So if you look at the rest of the mini, so yes, I have done highlighting and shading, but his skin is all just his skin colour. The top part of his robe is just brown. They're just a consistent colour. There are no other like weathering effects or anything like that going on there. But as I got into more, further into highlighting and shading the bottom part of his robe here, I just wasn't loving it. I don't really know exactly what it was. I couldn't pick out exactly what about it was just making me feel like I could be doing a better job. I think I was doing a better job of the front than the back. But yeah, I think because it was just all one color, like yes, there's the darker and lighter versions of it for the highlighting and the shading, but in terms of it's just that part of his robe. And I think it was just not really interesting, I guess. Like, it's a cool color, but there just needed to be more to it, I suppose. And so what you'll see later in the video, and I'll talk about exactly what I'm doing with it when we get to it there, is I do a mud sort of splatter effect on it, because with the base I do a muddy, grassy sort of thing, and thinking about him as a character and what he's been doing in his context, I thought, well, his robes aren't going to be so clean. They're probably going to have splatters from mud and dirt and things like that. And so I spent a bit of time building that effect up, and that just took it from being like, yeah, it's looking alright to, okay, now we're actually looking pretty cool, because I introduced another element there, and it wasn't just this whole part of his robe that was just the one colour. And so, yeah, just as I was highlighting and shading, it just, it felt like something was missing. Whereas when I did the other parts, because I think there's other details there, it didn't feel like that with them. So take the top part of his robe that's brown, I wasn't getting that feeling with that part like I was with this part, because there were the bones and the other ties that are going around and things like that. And so I think because there was enough other elements going on there, it was fine to leave that as just brown. But here, there isn't anything else at all. There's nothing going over the top, there's nothing to break up the colour, and it just, it looked too clean, I suppose, was probably the problem. And so adding in that extra element just brought it more to life, I guess, and really just finished it off well. So I think that this part here is a really, really good example of how sometimes something else does need to be introduced. We try not to spend too long on each mini, and so adding that extra sort of weathering and dirty effect did add more time. But I do think it was worth it to really kind of bring it all together and just finish it off nicely. So yeah, the way that I'm going about the shading and the highlighting here is very, very similar to what I've been doing in the past. I wasn't exactly sure of how to go about it with this, because like I said when I was talking earlier, I now have quite a wide range of each colour. So say with red, for example, when I'm highlighting and shading red, I base coat with a mid-tone reds, that Carnage red that I've got, and then I've got darker reds that I can use to shade, and I've got brighter reds that I can use to highlight. And by starting with a mid-range red, the most important thing there is that it gives me lots of room to brighten it while still keeping it red and not going towards that pink kind of tone. But here, with the Vallejo coloured blue-green, it's the only one that I've got that's that tone. I don't have lighter and darker versions of it because it's not just, you know, it's not just a red or a green. It's a bit of a mix of, well, it's called blue-green, so it's obviously a mix of blue and green. So yeah, I wasn't really too sure of how to balance the colors and make them look right. So for the shading, I just mixed a bit of the darkest blue in that I had, the Breon blue. So at least it kept that blue tone. I wasn't sure if it may have been better to have added some green in as well. I think probably in the end it was okay. It sort of, I think it worked all right in the end. And then for the highlighting, you can see I've just mixed in quite a very, very pale light blue that I've got. Just my Reaper one there, LED blue. And that didn't overpower the actual blue-green Vallejo color itself. It just lightened it off nicely. And so all I'm doing here is just putting some paint down where the light would be hitting, and then I'm a brush licker, so I then lick the paint off, leave the bristles wet, and then just feather the edges out. And every layer, now I'm doing the final layer here, I've got some white mixed in, so every layer just got a bit lighter and lighter, and the area that I put the paint in got less and less and less, and I feathered it out less and less and less, just so that it builds the contrast where the light would be hitting the most, but it does also create that smooth transition between one stage of the highlighting and the next. And so, you know, earlier on in the video, I was talking about focusing on those techniques that I've developed for myself recently. That is one that that's a way of highlighting and shading that I found that works for me. Just that thinning the paint down, doing it in layers, feathering it out. And so, yeah, minis like this really help to reinforce that and help me to refine that. And yeah, so even though I was at this point not really thrilled with how it was looking because it was just a bit too clean and a bit too flat, yeah, the mud effect that I do in a minute really does just, I think, bring it to life, I suppose, and just ties it all together. Okay, so here's where I'm starting the muddy sort of weathering effect that I mentioned earlier. So this was just to, yeah, bring that part of his robe to life, and just to add in that extra element because it just looked like it was missing something. So you can see I'm just putting down initially I put down a very, very thin coat of it, mainly around the bottom of his robe and definitely concentrated around his feet where the robe would be going through the mud the most. But I also did little splotches of it up around his knees and things like that, just so that it wasn't just purely concentrated around the bottom. And once that dried, then I went back around and did another layer of it just to build up the concentration of it, but doesn't all have the same amount of concentration. So with the first layer, when it was quite thin, I spread it around quite a bit, but then in the next layer I didn't do it quite so much because there's going to be lots of mud around the bottom and where his feet are, not so much up around the top. And then I also just did little blobs just here and there so it looked like there was some paint splatter and things like that. And we'll get a shot of it, I suppose, when I rotate a little bit more, but I ended up being really, really happy with that. It's a very, very basic effect. I mean, you know, there are tons and tons and tons of pictures out there that you can find that, oh no, I'm still going with it here. Yeah, so many photos that you can find online, on Instagram, whatever, of people that have done a much, much better job of this than what I have, but I didn't want to spend all day on it, but it was something that robe definitely needed. So yeah, nothing needed to be done for the other parts because there was enough other elements to stop them from just looking flat. But yeah, that was really the case with that part of the robe, and I think that sort of mud splatter there just really sort of helped, and then it ties it into the base as well. So as I do this grassy part here, yeah, it just sort of helps to sell the look that he's been walking through, you know, the environment. He hasn't been, you know, his robes aren't brand new. He doesn't have a washing machine to throw them in, so they are getting quite dirty. And just with the last couple of steps here to finish off the base, Maggot is finished. So this is the second character ready to go into the box for when we start playing this game. So thank you very, very much for spending some time watching me paint another mini. I hope that you've gotten something out of this that you can use in your own painting, or just at the very least you've enjoyed watching. And yeah, please do leave a comment down below, something that you liked about the video and something that you think can be improved. I have made a few changes recently to how I'm putting these videos together, and so I would really like to hear if there's anything else that you think could be improved about them. Please do stop by the Facebook, Twitter and Instagram accounts that I have set up for this channel. That's where you can stay up to date with what I'm painting at the moment, so that you know what's going to be coming out soon. And if you've enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button and hit the subscribe one as well if you want to stay up to date with these Tainted Grail videos as they keep coming out. Like I said earlier, the Menhirs will probably be next, and then I'll be doing the Four Dweller as well. And yeah, thinking of doing a video of the dials that go at the bottom of the Menhirs. Plus we have heaps, like I said earlier as well, heaps of games coming through Kickstarter soon that I'll be getting to painting. So yeah, so hit the subscribe button so that you can stay up to date with them as they come out. So with all of that being said, this is Matt from the Plastic Canvas signing out. Happy painting, everyone. Cheers.